Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sisters of Wellness. Sisters of Wellness, sewing into the lives of the next generation, where wisdom, empowerment, and love meet to inspire and nurture the next wave of leaders, healers, and change makers. I'm Pamela Marshall Coons. I am your host, and together we plant seeds of knowledge, resilience, and well being to cultivate a brighter future for generations to come. I'm so glad you joined us for this episode. So let us get started. Our guest tonight is Amy Trask. Amy is a brilliant young lady who is working on something that is so important to so many people, whether they know it or not. She is putting herself on the line to stand in the gap for those who are impacted by domestic violence. Amy, thank you so much for being here with us tonight on Sisters of Wellness.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
You and I were at an event yesterday honoring Susan B. Anthony, a woman who led the charge for women to get the right to vote. And the quote that struck me that I started with yesterday was she said, "Until we as women themselves write the laws and elect lawmakers to represent what we know is right and good, things will not change." And then I allowed Fannie Lou Hamer to say, "Until we support women who are running for office and help to write the legislation and help them get elected, that is the only way that we are going to see real sustainable changes," because we had some changes and we've seen them go away. So let me just first thank you for running for office. You ran here in Gainesville, Florida for state representative.
I did, yes.
So thank you for doing that. That is not an easy thing to do. So thank you for doing that. And then now participating in doing what Susan B. Anthony said to do, write the legislation. So thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Tell everyone what made you decide to get involved in this political arena to begin with, to run for office, first of all.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the biggest thing was my children. For me, we see this world changing so rapidly, and I didn't want there to be a conversation where my kids looked at me and said, "Well, what'd you do about it?" I wanted to make sure that I was doing everything I could to impact this generation and the next. We saw women's rights under attack. We saw equality being stripped away. We saw so many fundamental human rights violations. And it was so important for me to stand up and be a disruptor in those plans. I knew with every ounce of my being that I wasn't going to give up until change was made and change was held. And so that was my biggest impact. The other thing was that we just don't see enough representation of the people that are actually being impacted by these laws. We see the same income class, the same careers. We see the same people that look, like the people who held the seat before them. And we don't see middle class workers. We don't see single moms. We don't see people who have been marginalized or segregated, people that have actually been affected by the legislation that's being made. And so in order for us to have that voice and that perspective in a legislative seat, I knew I needed to run because I had a perspective that I could bring that could potentially and hopefully help people.
So you've never held an elected position before?
I never have. My grandfather was in the Florida House and was Florida Senate, but that was a long time ago, and we differed in some of our views, but he did a lot of good while he was there and some things that I'd like to change as well. So I grew up with the Bible and the Constitution. I grew up learning both of those pieces of history and documentation. And I grew up loving the law. Originally, I thought I was going to be an attorney. And so I studied as much as I could. And then personal circumstances made me have to study the law in order to defend, some people that I loved. And then through college, taking a lot of, government classes, participating in Model Senate, doing a lot of forums and summits, I fell in love with it. And I knew that that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I've written a few pieces of legislation, and one's in Tallahassee right now.
So before we get to that, for those who are watching, people who may feel like, well, I've never run for office before, I don't know that I'm qualified to do that. Yet we're watching things unfold, and nobody ran for office before they ran for office, right?
Right.
So what do you say to encourage people? Say again?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think there is a scary thought that we've put out there that you have to have a JD, or you have to have this big professional degree, a PhD, a JD, but you don't. I think, your experiences qualify you just as much as a degree would.
And your passion.
Absolutely.
Your passion. And that's what you bring to this, Amy Trask. Standing in the gap for those who have been impacted by domestic violence. More than 10 million Americans every year, behind closed doors of a place that should be safe, are impacted by domestic violence. You decided to do something about this. Why?
I survived it myself. Like I said in the Iguana and in the Gainesville Sun, 10 years ago, the worst moment of my life was the moment where my life was almost extinguished. And the moment that I tried to leave was the most dangerous time. And I had a small child, and both of our lives were in jeopardy. And so I knew, from that experience, from how traumatized I was, how terrified, from the years of subsequent recovery, both mentally and spiritually and physically, that I needed to do something to address this so that other people wouldn't have to experience what I did. And I looked at our legislature, and we had resources that helped us identify when we were in situations and resources after we were gone, but we weren't addressing that moment where we actually have to leave. And so I worked with so many people to try and come up with an idea that would help us at that critical juncture, at the most dangerous time in one of those relationships, is when you try to leave. And so addressing that was the crux of it. And I knew that I wanted to do it just because I knew firsthand where the dangers were.
What happened to you?
10 years ago, I was making eggs, and I had a little one who was up and ready for the world and wanted to be awake. And my partner at the time had come home just a few hours before, was drunk and passed out on the couch, and wanted my child to be quiet. And that was not going to happen. My child was awake and ready, and he was going to make my child shut up no matter what. And so I ran to grab my baby, and I tried to call 911, and my phone was thrown and shattered, and so was I. And so there was a brief moment of stillness where I was like, this is it. I'm going to die. I just need to hold on and protect my baby until the police get here. I had no way of calling the police anymore. I prayed that my neighbors had called. And, it was the most terrifying moment of my life. And then, cut to, I'm at a domestic violence shelter, and he has taken my child and disappeared for 2.5 years. And I had no idea if my child was alive or if he was okay. And so for that moment, I contacted every attorney on the Florida bar and the website, on the Florida bar's website, to see if they could, help me pro bono. And I couldn't find any help. So I memorized the entire chapter of statutes that dealt with child custody. And I said, okay, I'm going to fight like hell, and I'm going to get my kid back. And, my shelter was amazing, and they provided so many resources and helped me, but I fought and I got my kid back. And so that helped. That experience showed me a lot, where where we need to be impacting the law to help people that are surviving what I did.
For those of you who are joining us, thank you so much for joining us. And please share this because this information is so critical. There's so many people who are dealing with this. There are people who know of people who are dealing with this domestic violence. And so, Amy, you said you had hoped that your neighbors would call. They knew of challenges that you were having, fights that were happening or something. Why did you think your neighbors would call?
Sure. So abuse comes in a lot of different forms, and it can be financial, it can be verbal, it can be emotional, it can be physical. And it was not uncommon to hear my partner screaming at me or calling me names or making fun of me. It was not uncommon to hear certain expressions that were terrifying. At this point, at this juncture, my phone had been thrown and shattered. I had been thrown. I was physically on top of my child, shielding him with my body and begging for him to stop. And it didn't happen. At one point, I remember the neighbors banging on the wall, saying to stop. But it was not uncommon. I mean, there was a history prior to this incident. It was not the first time that he had acted this way. Unfortunately, when you're in that situation, it's, there are conditions like battered person syndrome, previously called battered women syndrome. There's learned helplessness. There's so many different things that we can point to.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter, though, is it's not easy to leave. Especially when you have kids, there's like, can I do this on my own? Can I survive? Can I even make it out the door safely? Or will I or my child be injured? What happens if I call the police? Will the police take my child from me? Like, there are so many fears that run through your mind, and it prevents so many people from leaving their abusive partners. And so it's a really traumatizing thing to go through. But I think that, talking about it will help us, lessen the stigma that surrounds it, and then we can really find solutions.
But it seems as if the cases are rising, and younger people as well. I saw something that was going to be happening here in this area for teens who are being impacted by domestic violence. And parents, please,
Yes.
please, whatever you can do, because as you said, this is a disorder just like anything else, and you can't cure him. I can't cure him, and your daughter, your son cannot cure this person. You may end up losing them.
Yeah, I was 20 when I had my first baby. So I was 20. I was 19 when I got pregnant. So it's, and I grew up in a very religious household. So did he. And, when we found out we were pregnant, the answer from our pastor, from our families, were, you have to get married.
Yeah.
You have a baby, you have to get married. And then when I started reaching out to my networks, the answer became, well, you married him, you can't divorce him. The Bible says you can't divorce him. So then, for me, I know leading up to that moment, it was like, there were so many thoughts running through my head. Like, how do I protect myself? I took out a big life insurance policy. I wrote a will. I made sure that my loved ones had copies of both. I made the beneficiary, a family member. And so there's so many layers and so many levels that people just don't think about. And it gets really complex. But, going through the experience that I did, we had a family court liaison, and her name was Cheyenne, and she was, it was her mission in life to educate family law attorneys, prosecutors, and judges on domestic violence, on the impacts that it has on children and on their adults, their guardians, to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, to talk about battered person syndrome, because the question has always been, well, why didn't you just leave? And it's not that easy, and it's not that's not a simple question to answer. And so she was trying to expand that knowledge, but I mean, for a long time, it wasn't those conversations weren't being had either in open or behind closed doors. And so this is an area that we need to be talking about so we can prevent other people from going through it.
Amy Trask has written legislation for the state of Florida that is in the House right now in committee.
So it's been assigned to committee in both chambers. We just got the approval to be on the agenda in the House. We are still working on the Senate, but we do have sponsors and co-sponsors in both chambers.
What happened to you is what gave you the passion, as happened so many times, like with the Moms Demand Action, Moms Against Drunk Drivers, women coming, Susan B. Anthony, Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, seeing things that are happening. What do you say to other women in other states? Because this legislation is just for Florida. What do you say to them to give them the courage, besides your phone number, to say, show me how you did it? What do you say to others who are watching to give them the courage to do what you've done in leaving and then crafting legislation to help protect future generations?
Sure. For me, I just think the number one thing that I wish someone would have told me is to know that, like, it is possible, and your life has so much more meaning and so much more. There's so much more that you can give to yourself and to your kids, to your future partner, and you owe it and deserve it to be safe and to be loved. And being with anyone who makes you feel less than absolutely everything is not the person that you should be with, because you deserve so much more in this life. So first, I would say that. And then in terms of trying to leave, I would just think about, what you could have. And in terms of legislation, I would use your experience, and I would find people that went through it with you. And I would link arms, and I would write legislation that helped you leave and stay safe. That would be, you don't have to be an attorney. You don't have to be a PhD or a clinical worker or a prosecutor. You don't have to be any of those things to write legislation. Put something down on paper, find a legislator who believes in you and believes in your story and believes in what you're trying to do. And they'll help you. If you have a good idea, they're there to help you. So that's what I would say.
So tell us exactly what your legislation will do.
Sure. So mine does a few things. The first thing is it makes the definitions of dating violence and domestic violence statutorily congruent. They are defined separately. So with domestic violence, you have to be married, you have to have a child in common, live together, or be blood related. So when you're in a dating situation and you don't live with your partner, it's not the same thing, and it's not weighed the same, and there aren't the same consequences. So making them weigh the same.
But dead is dead.
Yeah. But
so that's crazy to me, because if assault and battery in the street is the same regardless to who's doing it, it's amazing that this gets separated. That doesn't make any sense. But thank you for doing this.
Yeah, so it makes them weigh the same, which means that we're going to hold perpetrators accountable, and we're going to be allowing victims of dating violence to access resources. So the second thing that it does is it opens up all the resources that we have for domestic violence survivors to dating violence survivors, namely the Attorney General's Address Confidentiality Program. The actual title of the program is for domestic violence victims. And so there's already lots of loopholes to try and get a lot of these resources, but opening it up to people who have survived dating violence allows them the same dignity of trying to move forward with their lives without being fearful and looking over their shoulder every half a second to see if their abuser is there. They can move on with peace of mind, knowing that they're safe. And that is so huge and so important. The third thing that it does is it establishes a coordinating council under the FDLE that coordinates with task forces that are already in the statutes addressing domestic violence, but the most important thing that task force does, or that coordinating council does, is they establish a website that allows victims to discreetly notify police and see police response before their abuser even knows that they've been contacted.
Hmm.
So what that does is an abuse victim can go online. They can sign up just like they would for Stitch Fix or any other email subscription. And they say, here's my name, here's my address, this is who's hurting me. And then they select a PIN or a code phrase that they can use discreetly. Once they press submit, that information gets sent to dispatch, and they receive a unique phone number, a randomly generated phone number for them to save in their phone. So when they're ready, and they need help and they can't call 911, they call that randomly generated phone number that they've saved however they choose, like mom, dad, bestie, wifey, whatever. They call that number, and if they can't speak, they enter that PIN number. If they can speak, they use that code phrase that's unique to them, and it immediately dispatches police. It tells dispatch that they've identified who it is. They've said that who it is because they've correctly used that PIN word or that code phrase. And so dispatch sends police, seeing that they're in need of help. And police will go to the situation, already knowing who the alleged perpetrator is, who the alleged victim is. And they will know that it's a domestic violence situation when they walk in.
Had you ever called the police before?
Yeah. And it's, yeah. I've called
Well,
police.
no. It's okay. It's okay because that's part of the trauma that people are under.
Yeah.
The trauma and the fear. It's a lock that nobody understands unless they've been in it.
Yeah. Well, I've said this before. I mean, I've toured the state, and I've talked about this bill with hundreds of survivors and domestic violence advocates and social workers, caseworkers, police officers. And, in my situation, it's hard. It's almost like brainwashing, because you get shoved down the stairs, but then when you wake up, he's there to stitch you up, right, and give you ice. And you get punched or you get hit, and then it's like, oh, you slipped, or you really shouldn't have said that. You just made me so mad, and I'm so sorry that it went that way. We're going to get better, And so there's so many situations where you're gaslit and you truly think it's your fault. So when you call police and the police get there, it's like, what do I say? How do I explain this? What do I do? And the responses that I got initially were, that's your husband. You guys need to work it out, right? It sounds like a typical marital spat. I've gotten, that sucks, but there's no crime here. I can't tell you the varying level of responses that I've gotten from police, but what I will say is that seeing 911 dialed on my phone took my abuser from 0 to 100 in a second. And the problem with having one uniform number to call, whether it's 911 or any other 3-digit number, is that it's really easy for the abuser to figure out what that number is. And if they see it in your phone, your life is in danger. So in order for any type of help to be effective, we have to use a number that they can't guess. And so that was the whole intent behind why I created the website the way that I did. But I will say, even, when my person was arrested, like, I didn't even get a victim's pamphlet. It's not a commonly talked about issue, and unfortunately there's a lot of shame that gets attached to it, and we have a long ways to go. I will say Alachua County, from the officers that I've talked to, we're getting a lot better. I know that there are a couple of counties throughout Florida who have really great programs in place and councils, and they do a lot of work in that, but as a state, we have a long way to go.
Was he ever arrested?
Yes. But I will say, when he was never held accountable for taking my child.
Really?
Never held accountable. In fact, I got a letter in the mail from the attorney that was prosecuting the case, who said, we can't prove that it was him who attacked you in a trial, and therefore we're going to drop the charges. The first time he was arrested, he got a slap on the wrist. He had to take anger management and BIP. I think it was like a 12-week class, and then it was off his record. And then the second time that it happened, there weren't really any consequences. It was just because in Florida, when you have to, at least when it happened for me, I don't know if it's any different now, we both had custodial rights, so it wasn't considered kidnapping. But when we went to trial, and I defended myself, I had the shelter advocates. So I had the executive director. I had multiple advocates, the family court liaison. I had medical records. I had police records. I had the neighbors. I had church members. I mean, I can't tell you how many witnesses I had on my defense, on my behalf. And we won, and I got everything I asked for when it came to my kid. And he's been out of the picture for years now, but it was very validating to hear a judge say, like, I'm sorry, and you were wrong, and you were wronged, and this shouldn't have happened to you. And it was validating to have everything I asked for and have everything taken from him. But no, he was, I have that letter that I was sent, and I look at it so frequently because it reminds me of what's at stake. And it reminds me of just how far we've come, but how much farther we need to go.
How are your children doing?
They're wonderful.
Yeah.
They're so good.
They understand what happened and what you're doing, and they are amazing young men.
Yeah.
Little boys.
So my 11-year-old was the one that was alive and impacted when this happened. And they know everything that happened. And he's been, he went through trauma as well. And, he has opened up about the things that he experienced when he was with his dad. And he was on medication for a bit. But he's been so good. I mean, we went from so much trauma from not eating to hiding under blankets to doing all of those things, from not even knowing who I was when he met me again, to being one of my best friends, to getting straight A's, to doing soccer and swimming. I mean, he's just been, he's so smart. Like he's brilliant. He's so good with science. And, we bought breakfast for the entire police department about a year ago, and he got challenge tokens from all of the different officers. But when he saw that science lab, oh my gosh, it was like heaven on earth.
Wow.
They're both doing great. They've come to Tallahassee with me. They've talked to people about this bill and the importance of it. But my 11-year-old will be the first one to stand up and be like, I survived this. My mom survived this. And, we need to protect people. If this bill only protects one person, like, I will go to sleep at night feeling so much better. And if it's the only thing legislatively that I ever accomplish, I'll feel better in my heart about it. But the truth is, FDLE's Uniform Crime Report in their most recently reported year in 2020 said we had 106,615 cases. And we know that only 50% of cases are actually reported. So we're looking at 212,000 cases at a minimum, and that's not acceptable.
No.
It's not acceptable.
No. Amy Trask, thank you so much for what you're doing. What's the likelihood of this getting passed?
I hope it's high. We have bipartisan support in large fashion in both chambers. I have so much Republican support, so much Democratic support. We've gotten the approval of 2 domestic violence shelters, of hundreds of DCF and CPC workers, victims. I mean, we've gotten a lot of support on this bill. And so I'm hopeful that it'll pass. Right now, the tricky part is getting it heard in the Senate. So if you know of anyone who wants to help, please call Senator Jonathan Martin's office and ask them to put this on the agenda. But we're about to be heard in the House. I've met with almost all of the committee members. I've met with
Mhm.
all of the legislative staff. I've met with the administrative staff. I've met with all the chairs, and everyone seems to be on board so far. And I think that's because this issue is not a partisan issue. It's not a
Right,
red issue or a blue
right.
issue or a white issue. This is just an issue. Um,
Yes.
and so I'm grateful that so far all of the legislators that we've met have really been focused on trying to get this through, because we all want to protect our constituents and our neighbors and our daughters and our moms, and we want to make sure that we keep America and Florida a safe place to live.
Ricardo watching said that's so important. So many people need these resources and to know how to access them. Sometimes just knowing safety is within reach is enough for the first step towards freedom. Thank
Yes.
you so much, Ricardo, for watching. And everyone else who's watching, please share this. And Amy, best of luck to you in getting this legislation passed. And as it passes in Florida, we pray that it will encourage this same kind of strengthening of any current legislation in other states, that women will come together and recognize that there is power in our strength and us standing together. So again, thank you so much for being a guest here tonight on Sisters of Wellness and what you're doing in the community and across the state.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Please keep us posted on how this legislation goes.
Absolutely.
Thank you all so much for joining us for this edition of Sisters of Wellness. If you have any topics that you are interested in that you would like for us to talk about, or you'd like to be a guest on Sisters of Wellness, please send us an email. Our website is www.atthewellnessnetwork.org, www.atthewellnessnetwork.org. There it is right there. Again, thank you so much for joining us for Sisters of Wellness, sowing into the lives of the next generations. May the seeds that we've planted today take root in your hearts and in your minds, blooming into strength, purpose, and most of all, hope. Until next time, keep sowing, keep growing, keep shining, and stay well. I'm Pamela Marshall Coons at the Wellness Radio TV and at the Wellness Network Publishing. Remember, there is healing at the well. Make it a fantastic moment, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Amy.